This was voted on in the community tab where like 42 people voted, and that's super awesome, and thank you so much for that. This jumped ahead at the last second, so I thought it was fair to go ahead and go with this as the winner. So without further ado, here is Instax versus Polaroid. In the beginning of instant film, there was Polaroid, and Polaroid was good. The inventor of instant film itself, Polaroid dominated the landscape for decades, even felling the industry giant Kodak for patent infringements. But alas, those same patents expired by the end of the millennium. Combined with the advent of digital photography, this helped spell doom for the innovators of instant photography. In the years leading up to Polaroid's Kodak lawsuit victory, Fujifilm had licensed Kodak's instant film technology to use in Japan, thinking its rectangular format would help them win over consumers that had already mostly rejected the Polaroid system. This led to Fujifilm's Photorama film line, which, interestingly enough, was also almost fully compatible with Kodak's instant film cameras. The Photorama cameras even bore a strong resemblance to their Kodak counterparts, but even this system did not become the hit Fujifilm had hoped for. Following the lawsuit victory over Kodak, Polaroid entered into an agreement with Fujifilm to allow them to continue to produce basically Kodak film in exchange primarily for technology dealing with things like VHS tapes. Anybody remember these things? This technology sharing agreement allowed Fujifilm to continue to attempt to figure out what would make instant film work in Japan. Their initial research for Photorama had revealed that Japanese consumers considered Polaroid film to be of inferior quality. This was primarily because the saturation and warmth of Polaroid film was considered unrealistic by Japanese photographers. Additionally, the Polaroid square format was deemed difficult to reproduce. Also, the fact that Polaroid film had to be imported made Japanese consumers feel that it just wasn't worth the expense. Fujifilm continued to work to improve their film offerings, upping the ISO to 800 as opposed to the 160 ISO of earlier versions. In order to assist in consistency, Fuji also included a flash that automatically fired with every Photorama camera. Photorama gave way to Ace, which then by the late 1990s gave way to Instax. Instax was a hit in Japan due to the lower cost, more neutral appearance of its images, and probably the consistency of images due to the flash integration. They even teamed up with Polaroid around 1999 to release a camera in America with Polaroid branding. Yes, there was a Fuji Instax camera with Polaroid branding on it. However, this was a failure, and soon Instax was also a failure in America, where it would lay dormant for several years. As Polaroid collapsed in a calamity of mismanagement and the digital onslaught, Fujifilm's Instax flourished, leading to Instax Wide and other formats, and eventually a triumphant return in America where it became the leading analog photography medium. Long story short, the last Polaroid factory was indeed saved and was turned into what became the Impossible Project, which is now Polaroid again. So after years of trial and error, Impossible/Polaroid Original/Polaroid has finally produced what looks like the best and most consistent film stocks of their rebirth. The film is also several dollars cheaper than it was even just a few years ago. Though the packs are still limited to 8 frames, the frames have gotten thinner and developing time is dramatically improved. The one thing that remains to be seen is how these colors hold up over the test of time. Meanwhile, Fujifilm Instax is pretty much set in stone. The color is perfectly neutral with medium saturation and stellar sharpness. I actually might say low saturation, but yeah. The film packs have 10 frames and are still nearly half the cost of Polaroid film. Fujifilm is a juggernaut with only one fatal flaw. The cameras are terrible. However, companies like Lomography and Mint offer quality alternatives across the financial spectrum for Instax fans. I recently tested the Lomo Graphlog back. Click the thumbnail of the video at the end of this video to catch that video. Anyway, my experience with the Lomo Graphlog back revealed the extreme quality and detail that the film can render, and the development speed makes shooting a true pleasure because you see it barely a minute after you shoot it, and you can watch it emerge. And though it takes about upwards of 10 minutes to get the full frame in there. Like, it does show the initial picture faster than Polaroid, although as I mentioned, that time gap has shortened dramatically. So combine that with the financial and numbers advantage that Fuji has, and Instax completely crushes Polaroid's unstable and overpriced butt, right? Not really. Polaroid has closed any sharpness gap, and the fragility of its development has improved. So no longer do Polaroid shooters have to live in constant fear of light strikes. You still have to be a little careful very early in the development, but you can check it within just a couple of minutes and actually see if you have focus, which is a huge improvement over sometimes having to just wait until your entire session is over to see if you got anything. Polaroid's renditions of blues and reds blow Fuji's out of the water, and I find the square format infinitely more endearing than the overly narrow or small Fuji formats. Even Instax Wide is not wide enough to be cinematic most of the time, but it's too narrow to feel entirely comfortable to me. I'm also a person who has issues with APS-C sensors because I feel like they're too squat, but not wide enough. I like a good comfortable square, and it works for Polaroid and Hasselblad, and I know square gets a bad rap sometimes, and there is kind of something to the reproducibility of squares versus rectangular formats that used to be a problem for Polaroid in Japan, although people don't really print a lot anymore, and that's tragic. But that's also what's nice about instant film, is that at least it gets a physical object in people's hands. Good Polaroid classic cameras can be found for $40 range, up to a few hundred of course. And no Fuji capable camera really holds a candle to a classic SX-70 or SLR 680/690. Maybe Mint's extremely pricey, was it the RF-70 or something like that? While Polaroid still costs a pretty penny, buying in volume will bring a pack down to just about $5 away from a pack of comparable Fuji Instax Wide, I think. It's even closer if you can convert your camera to take I-type film, which has no battery and is a couple dollars cheaper. Polaroid film is also still far more capable of manipulation like emulsionless, and though you can do certain things like sometimes transparencies with Fuji Instax film, it really doesn't work the way that Polaroids do, where Polaroids have a gelatinous emulsion that can be removed, and we will have more about this in at least one upcoming video. As always, this truly comes down to personal preference and situational needs. If extreme clarity, consistency, color balance, and a low price matter to you, the choice is pretty obvious. If you prefer more interpretive images, more saturation, different aspect ratios, better cameras, and a company that seems to give a rip about film photography right now, Polaroid is a great choice. And this might get somebody going in the comments, like screaming something like Polaroid simp, but I do largely prefer the saturation, contrast, and aspect ratio of Polaroid film. I largely prefer the cameras too, but when it comes to something like the Lomograph lock back, being able to pump double the amount of film through it to experiment with and get more comfortable with 4x5 is pretty freaking amazing. I personally shoot both. I prefer Polaroid most of the time, but with my Lomograph lock on the horizon, I'll be shooting a ton of Instax Wide when that arrives. How about you try them out, and if it's not for you, maybe come back to it later and leave it to others to enjoy it. It's okay for people to enjoy things. So, yeah, it's not a contest. You could buy a Mint camera, an SX-70, and a crap ton of film for both of them, and it still wouldn't cost nearly as much as whatever digital camera you're going to be replacing in 2 years. Thanks again for everyone who voted, and if you'd like to support this channel further for even as little as $1 a month, you can join my Patreon. My patrons are listed here. You can go to the link in the description or look me up on Patreon to support me. And if you don't have any money to support or don't want to, you can always subscribe and turn on notifications, leave a comment, like this video. Did I say that already? Anyway, thank you so much for the support, and if you're still watching this at this point, you're amazing. I'll see you soon. Thanks.